Hello and welcome to the launch of Footprint Intelligence's latest report, Is Regenerative the Future of Farming? In association with Nestlé Professional. I'm Nick Hughes, as Footprint Associate Editor and co-author of the report. Shortly you'll hear from an expert panel chaired by my fellow co-author David Burrows on location at a dairy farm in Cumbria, exploring how corporate commitments to regenerative agriculture can help build food system resilience. Agriculture is in the unenviable position of being both a significant source of greenhouse emissions and highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. But first, we need to understand exactly what do we mean by the term regenerative agriculture. And that's not an easy question to answer. It depends on who you speak to. Regen ag is not easily pigeonholed, but its philosophical essence, if you like, is the mirror of extractive farming. Rather than creating external costs, you're putting more back in, both to the land and society, than you're taking out. It does, however, have some core principles. Regenerative agriculture should minimize soil disturbance and protect the soil surface. It should create diversity through practice such as companion and cover cropping. It should maintain living roots by leaving plants in place for longer, which encourages the build-up of organic matter. And it can, in the right context, integrate livestock to help recycle nutrients as part of mixed farming systems. Perhaps most importantly, regenerative agriculture should be context-specific and farmer-led, and I can't stress that enough. No two farm is identical, and Regen Ag does not seek to prescribe a set of practices that farmers must follow. It's about working within the individual farm's biological, chemical, and physical ecological limits. There is, however, broad agreement on some of the outcomes it should deliver: high levels of soil carbon, nutrients and plant diversity, abundance of pollinators and invertebrates, low use of artificial inputs. It should also deliver high standards of animal welfare, where livestock is integrated into the farm ecosystem. More contested is the extent to which regenerative agriculture must also have a social or people dimension, paying producers a fair price for their food, facilitating knowledge sharing and supporting innovation, ensuring that the food produced from regenerative agriculture is nutritious, affordable, and accessible. A key motivator for businesses investing in regenerative agriculture is to help achieve their net zero ambitions. Companies are confident that Regen Ag could have a significant role to play in reducing those emissions. There's a lot of work to be done before businesses can credibly claim to have delivered significant emissions reductions from a shift to regenerative agriculture. Without transparent reporting and accountability, there is undeniable risk that commitments to regenerative agriculture simply provide a cover for corporate greenwash. And until commercial strategies are aligned with sustainability strategies, we won't get to a position where companies can guarantee they're supporting the transition to regenerative farming. Do stay tuned for our expert panel, who will now dive into these topics in greater detail.
I think for us as Nestlé, what we're seeing is that there isn't full understanding of what regenerative agriculture is. And that's partly because there isn't actually a proper definition that everyone, not like organic, when everyone knows exactly what's required. So the challenge we've got in terms of communicating to consumers is how do we find the bits about regenerative agriculture that we can get across that consumers will understand. So my view on it, having spoken to a couple of the marketing people, is that instead of trying, because as you would have seen today, it's a complex subject. And we can't get that across in one go. So it's how do you get small messages out and do it in a way that is genuine. So through our farmers. So we've already started. So Richard Henderson was on the Nescafe advert, one of our farmers. We've had Scott and various others in another advert. And it's just the farmers telling the story, but in small bite-sized chunks that people can understand. We think that's probably going to land better than trying to say too much.
Yeah.
And I think in food service it's really challenging because there's no scope for labelling on food.
Yeah.
So whereas in the supermarket, it's always the example I give, I'm a bit like a scratch record, but I wouldn't personally dream of buying a caged egg, when I go to the supermarket, I look for free range. But when you eat out, you don't necessarily ask whether your eggs are free range. And I think it's the same with kind of food service in general. It's very price sensitive. So there's no scope for on-pack labelling because we're selling catering size packs to customers who then use it in recipes. So I think the onus is for me in my role to get customers to understand what regenerative means and put that into their procurement policies rather than aim at the consumer, because we're B2B anyway. So trying to educate customers about what regenerative means, I think it's a buzzword that's really gathering in momentum. And, you know, regen what? Sort of, I've heard of this concept, but I don't really understand it. And then there's another kind of customer who kind of understands it and wants to be able to get food stories to the consumer of, you know, the cliched sort of farm to fork kind of reconnecting with food and farming. And so, but we struggle in food service because we don't have that legacy of visible supply chains and that, you know, the multi-fragmented supply chains. So it's really difficult getting those stories out. But matching the consumers with the end story is the big challenge here, and it's really been thought-provoking here because there's so many good news stories that I've heard about the role of livestock and the role of farming, but I just don't think the general public know about that. So we have a big role to play in that, but I'm not sure what the answers are.
Again, I mean, I can just quickly say, I mean, so one of the aspects of our milk plan, as we call it, is half of it's environmental, but half of it's social, and things like getting to young children and to schools is so we, our farmers, sign up to, as many of them as possible, sign up to do school visits. So just like you have, and I mean, Lee, do you want to share about Steve and the kids that have just turned up?
Yeah, so Tuesday, there's an organisation called LEAF, you might have heard of, Linking Environment and Farming. So the daughter from a farm that supplies us and Nestlé, the daughter-in-law actually, used to be a teacher, and now she's fully involved in the farm, but still sees that gap in the syllabus. And so there was 120 15-year-olds from 4 different schools that came to this farm the other day, and there were all of the supply trade. So you had a vet there, you had people there supplying feed, those supplying machinery. You know, what I did this morning in terms of biology and regenerative systems, we did earthworm counts, etc. And 15-year-olds, you know, are making decisions for their life, aren't they? And yeah, this was a rural area, and yet there was a heck of a lot of misunderstanding, let alone, you know, engaging with perhaps a more urban population as well.
Yeah. And I do think there's an opportunity, like we've got the Choose Hospitality pledge, but it's really about collaboration and getting out there, finding the best ways to get to young people. So we're talking to agricultural colleges at the moment to see how we can do that. And there's a whole Young Farmers Association. I don't think anybody's doing anything with them. So and then getting into schools themselves in terms of careers offices. I mean, I bet anybody goes into careers office, how many people in there say, have you thought about farming? It's just not on the agenda. So but as an industry, we need to all try and work on it together. I'd love it if we can.
And do more. I mean, we have 3 dairy units, 2 in Cumbria and 1 over in Northumberland, and we bring primary school children out of inner city Newcastle onto the farm near Hexham. So these are typically families that very rarely leave the estate, never mind get out into the countryside. So, you know, you're starting to sow that seed at a very early stage of their learning and that sort of curiosity, but thinking more broadly about how we get the message across to consumers. You know, Lee talked about our Golden Hooves brand. There's a little QR code on there that leads you down, you know, to the story of First Milk and what we do with all our members. So it's about really enabling them to find out that information for themselves once they're curious about the word regenerative. You know, what does it mean? Compared to organic or conventional.
And the word itself is so positive by definition. It's so rare that, because I think in my world is sustainability reporting, and you're talking about net zero neutrality, like do less of this, do less of that, and just to regenerate is just so, there's such a buzz about that feeling. So I think there's a lot of positive things I've picked up from today that we can communicate, and we need it in this space because we really need to give some positivity, because I think people have given up, that they feel powerless or it's all negative, and I think there's huge scope there for the messaging.
The big danger would be if it just became, as Charlie said, slapped on every package, then the value goes, doesn't it? You know, it's got to be a protected thing, really, isn't it? It's not something you can greenwash with everything. It's got to be specific and focused and meaningful.
Does that make this a really sort of crucial time then for regenerative food and farming? Because we often talk about just regenerative farming, but we're talking about much more than that. We're talking about the farmers, the food, the consumers, the kind of food that people, society wants to eat, healthy food. Is this a really sort of crucial moment, how this is communicated then over the coming few months and years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the guiding principles that we've grappled with the last year or two is, you know, on the way to becoming B Corp accredited, you know, B stands for benefit. So what benefit are we producing by existing? You know, what benefit to the people that work for us, to the people that supply us, what benefit to the communities that we may impact positively or negatively, what is the benefit to the environment? And I think that's the essence of regenerative farming. So we may be seeking to do less harm in life, but do we seek to do net benefit? And that's the difference. That's the difference between, I think, any other style of farming and regenerative farming is the outcome is net positive. And you know, we need to be able to measure that, but it's outcome focused as opposed to input focused, because it's what you've achieved that counts.
Yeah, great question. Why is everyone looking at me? Yeah, I guess, gosh, I mean, we're not new to it up in Cumbria. Obviously, you know, we've probably got the highest rainfall county in the whole of the UK, probably. Certainly in the lakes you have. So, you know, I think from my perspective as a dairy farmer, you know, it's coping with the variability of what's coming at us. Pasture-based dairy farming is highly resilient. You know, we can cope with that, but it throws the emphasis on the correct infrastructure. You know, we saw tracks and fences and water troughs and stuff today. You couldn't just implement this system on any old block of land. It's got to be really well set up for it, because, you know, we've had a particularly wet sort of 6 or 8 weeks now. You've got to be able to get in there and harvest the grass with cows rather than machinery. So there's all sorts of things like that have got to be right for it to work. And yeah, it is becoming more unpredictable, I guess. You know, we have extreme heats and extreme dry, and then of course now it's nothing like last year. It's incredibly wet. We generally get a dryish spell at this time of year, and this year it's gone the exact opposite. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's gone.
No, I think for businesses like ours, fundamentally it comes down to resilience. Yeah, and we can only be more resilient if we can find a way to combat the effects of climate change, and that's one of the arguments we use internally a lot more, just to be able to get the funding and the resources to be able to do the work. But with regenerative agriculture, I mean, the food industry accounts for something like 30% of all the greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore regenerative agriculture is probably the single biggest thing we can do to try and start to reverse some of that. And therefore, and actually some of the evidence, it's early days, but anecdotally, I mean, what we found, for instance, with our wheat farmers is 2 or 3 years ago, we had the worst harvest for 40 years. It was 40% down. But those farmers that are practicing regenerative agriculture, as I said, it's more anecdotal, but they were able to be more resilient through that process. So we already can see that by implementing all these practices, it will make us more resilient. So that's the key thing.
Sorry.
I think one of the biggest challenges we've got on 2 of our farms is lack of rainfall, because the ones in the east and ones in a particularly dry part of Cumbria are, you know, moving toward, like, away from monoculture ryegrass swards to deeper rooted species. So deeper rooted herbs, when we go in this deep, where ryegrass sort of sits on the top sort of 4 centimetres, so you're actually, you know, you're tapping into moisture resource there through the dry spells, but also building organic matter in the soil, building more carbon in the soil. So that in turn, you know, helps us farm through those periods of time much easier, much more resilient.
Julie, did you want to?
Well, I was just going to say, I think one of the big drivers for it in a corporate world is the fact that we're companies now have to fill out TCFD reports, so Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, for those who don't know the jargon. But basically it's about trying to prove that you've built in resilience to your supply chain, like you were saying, Robin, in the face of growing climate change. So if companies can demonstrate that they've built regenerative principles into their supply chains, they're naturally, as you say, more resilient. So rather than it being a consumer drive, in my world, it's more companies having to prove to investors that they're forward thinking and that they're thinking, planning ahead. So that it gives me hope. It's only the first year of TCFD reporting this year, mandatory TCFD reporting that is, and I think the bar is fairly low, but I'm hoping it will increase and raise. And it has to get higher profile.
Yeah. And interesting, you mentioned investors as well. How can they help for a start, I suppose, in terms of, money flowing right down through the chain? And how does it work in this? I know there's a lot of talk about this sort of transition period, and I know regenerative is also going to take an awful long time, and there isn't an end goal. How do we get through the initial stages of potential drops in yield, and then combine that with the extreme weather, supply and demand? Interesting, maybe Richard, from your point of view as well, how farmers generally, are they nervous or are they excited by the idea of, changing crops and integrating more things?
I think very much there's farmers in two camps. Ones that will never change and they're stuck in the ways, and ones that are trying different things. There's always a different way. It's just find that, and you can't direct that from either Brussels or London. It is so specific to certain areas that, like as Robert says, he's on a dry farm. I wasn't so dry. You've experienced that. But, everything is, you can't broad brush anything with this. It is very everyone's different. So you've got to be a bit careful with it. But we are very adaptable farmers. They will survive if they want to. Yeah.
And I suppose we're learning all the time about what might work on certain farms and might not work on other farms.
Everything's changed so quickly. We farm in a different way to we did even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, completely different. Things are just evolving, aren't they? And it loses excitement. If it doesn't, you've got to move forward and move on.
In essence, we're all on a bit of a journey, and the milk plan with Nestlé has enabled that journey, if you like, to speed up. Certainly in our own instance, you've actually got that sort of financial confidence to try something a bit different. We've tried all sorts of things over the last few years. With multi-species swords and when to sow them, when not to sow them. We've sort of perfected the rotational grazing thing 30 years ago, but we were locked into this system, or at least I was, in my own mind, locked into this sort of system with chemical nitrogen. And we've slashed that by 2/3 in the last 3 years. So we're now using levels of chemicals that I never thought was possible. And we're measuring grass all the time, so we know we're still growing enough grass to feed the herd. But in terms of emissions, it's massive. But we probably wouldn't have done that without the sort of confidence that we got from being part of the Nestlé milk plant. So, it really, really matters. And it's significant money, but it takes significant money to make things happen.
And that's the key thing. So you asked about investors. Investors can either be, they're really important. They don't get talked about enough, I think, but because they can be a blocker as well. What we've done, I think, quite well in Nestlé is that Mark Schneider, our CEO, has got the investors behind. So we're putting 1.4 billion behind regenerative farming, and which is quite a lot of money, but you need to do that. To your point, yields potentially are going to go down the first couple of years. Our farmers need to feel confident that we're not going to walk away when that happens. We have to be there in the long term. And but that needs backing right from senior management. Otherwise, it's just not going to work.
And it's got to be long term, Robin, hasn't it? It's no good throwing money at it for a few years and then standing back, because nothing happens basically.
Yeah.
I think we've got to be careful to assume status quo is without risk, because there's all of these risks building. There's all of this exposure that's happening, whether it's weather, whether it's war, whether it's deglobalization. The status quo doesn't exist. have we got 60 harvests left? Well, who knows? But these things are real in the broad sense of it. So although the transition might be difficult, staying as we are is going to be pretty difficult as well. And it feels safer to do nothing, but soon catches up with you, doesn't it?
Yeah, because the investment you're talking about pales into insignificance when you look at on paper, the costs of climate change and the loss of crops. It's I think there's a naivety as well in the industry that, if crops fail, you simply shift supplier and, we're all going to be in the same boat having the same issues. So it's that long-term view that is really sensible. So I've loved hearing what Nestlé are doing in partnership to drive improvement.
And I think, Robin, we talked about this on the phone, is that we need to move fast, but one of your biggest challenges is, patience as well. Not personally, but, that those yields might go down. The carbon emissions might go up a little bit to start with.
Yeah.
But nobody panic.
Yeah.
This is the way to go.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not always easy, particularly if you're, the way our financial system is set up really globally is that a lot of it is about return on investment, and therefore if I'm going to invest this much money, I'm going to get return in 3 years. And when you're talking about nature, that just goes out the window. And so you have to, your business has got to be willing to take a different approach. And so having those conversations, we've been quite lucky in that we've been working on the milk plan since 2015, haven't we? And so over long term, you see that over time, the benefit does come. So we've got that experience that we can work off. But I think a lot of businesses are still unsure about that. But you're right, you can't go too fast in the sense also in that you've got to be able to record, and all the things we talked about this morning, you need standardised frameworks and all of that. But those are going to come. So on the other hand, you've got to start somewhere. So what I say to businesses, if you're not sure, just start at least, and then work backwards in the sense of how you're going to measure and all the rest.
Yeah, gotcha.
That does seem the winner from First Milk's approach. There's a plan to record, capture the data and act on it, whereas a lot of them haven't got that. They're doing the action and then thinking, how are we going to measure that then? Yeah. Whereas this is a bit more scientific and a bit more data driven, isn't it?
You need a baseline.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the things that came up in conversations for the report as well, is sometimes there's a desperation almost to label something first and then work backwards. Whereas you kind of want to look at it the other way around. What do we want to achieve? What do we need to achieve with this? Whether we have a label or not doesn't matter for the moment. Does it make it harder throughout the supply chain to convince everybody to move when there isn't that sort of regulatory threat, the guardrails? You can't say, well, this is coming from government like TCFD. You could say, this is coming, so we've got to do it. I presume at the moment you can't even say anything's coming.
No.
So does that make it harder, or is that where the opportunity is here that, that we can just ignore the policy for the minute? We've got to get on with it.
Yeah, I think our experience is you start where there's an open door. So those people who are open to try things and all that, just start there, start the work, and then other people get on board when they can see the benefit. And then if government policy comes later, that's great. And actually, then you're probably in a good place. So then that's where regulation potentially works for you, in the sense that it then creates a level playing field. So other people need to play catch up, but you're already there. Mm-hmm. So you just crack on and do what you need to do.
And it's always costlier if you're playing catch up in a shorter amount of time than if you play the long game. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the starting point has got to be that we all got to recognise what's broken the food system to start with, and no individual obviously has sole responsibility for that. But we had a cheap food policy and a abundant food policy since World War II, going right through the decades. And that kind of was starting to change, and then we've had the cost of living crisis. So all of a sudden, the focus is back on price. And yet, what we're going to get with the climate change scenario is just more volatility. So I think the companies that invest in regenerative farming, they do need to help fund the transition, but they're going to insulate themselves somewhat from the volatility, because Nestlé and First Milk working together for 20 years, that will carry on. We're not going to enter the commodity market and take a quick buck. Last year we could have done that, but our relationship meant more to us. We're trusting each other, and I think for those that do enter into this market, help farmers, the farmers will stay loyal, but the others will be more exposed to this volatility.
I think some have got further to go. So in terms of the business case for change, we've got 700 members that are all at various stages of a journey. The more we can make the business case as a co-op, the quicker we can take them on that journey. And actually, it's not that far away. We can make changes pretty quickly if we're well funded to do so. I think so. The whole supply and demand thing, actually, it's not irrelevant, but in a dairy farming scenario, we can act pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think that's. I've been told that's time to wrap up, but I think all the panelists are staying around anyway. So, or most of them, Robin, you've got to shoot off. I think.
Yeah.
But you can obviously grab them and ask questions afterwards. Thank you very much, everyone.